The clink of crystal glasses echoed across the dining room as my father slowly stood up, straightened his navy blazer and said, "You're not my daughter anymore." Like he was announcing a business decision, not erasing a human being, and I remember exactly how the chandelier light reflected off the polished mahogany table, how 20 relatives went silent at once, how my mother didn't look at me, not even for a second. "My name is Emily Carter. I'm 29 years old. 5 years ago, my parents disowned me for choosing to become a public school teacher. Tonight, I stood in a packed auditorium with over 3,000 people, and the governor of this state paused, looked down at his card, and said my name into a microphone that carried it across every corner of the room. But that moment didn't start there. It started at that table with that sentence, with the way my father said the word teacher like it tasted bitter. You have to understand something about my family. We weren't poor. We weren't struggling. We were the kind of upper-middle-class suburban family that cared about how things looked more than how they felt. My father was a corporate attorney. My mother ran charity boards and knew exactly which fork to use at every formal dinner. My older brother, Daniel, graduated from Harvard Law and had a job lined up before he even finished his final semester. And then there was me, the daughter who didn't quite fit the narrative. Growing up, the difference wasn't loud. It was quiet. It was the way my father introduced Daniel as my son, the future partner, and introduced me as Emily, she's still figuring things out. It was birthdays where Daniel got a new watch and I got a gift card. It was graduation day when my name was called and I scanned the crowd and saw 2 empty seats where my parents were supposed to be because Daniel had a networking dinner that same night. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself I didn't need their approval. I focused on what did matter to me. And what mattered to me was teaching. I didn't just want a job. I wanted to stand in a classroom where kids who had been overlooked their entire lives could feel seen, even just for 45 minutes a day. When I got my first offer from a public school district just outside the city, I remember sitting in my car in the parking lot, holding the letter in my hands, feeling something I had never felt before. Proud. Not because my family would approve, but because for the first time I was choosing something for myself. That night, I made the mistake of thinking they might understand. I made the mistake of thinking that maybe, just maybe, this would be the moment things shifted. My mother had said it before, in quieter moments, when my father wasn't around. As long as you're happy, Emily, that's what matters. I believed her. I walked into that dinner thinking I was finally bringing them something they could be proud of. I didn't realize then that I was walking into the moment that would cut me off from them completely. And what I didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the choice they were about to make that night would follow them all the way to a stage 5 years later, when my name would be the one they couldn't ignore. The room did not react right away, and that was the worst part, not the words themselves, but the silence that followed them, the way everyone froze like they were waiting to see if this was some kind of joke. And I remember looking around that long dining table and realizing no one was going to interrupt him. No one was going to say this had gone too far, not even my mother, who kept her eyes locked on her wine glass like if she just stayed still enough, she would not have to choose a side. And then my father repeated it, slower this time, like he wanted every person in that room to understand exactly what he meant. If you walk out of this house as a teacher, you walk out without a family. And something inside me went completely quiet, not shattered, not dramatic, just quiet, like a door closing in a place I could not reach anymore. And I remember placing my acceptance letter on the table in front of me, smoothing it out with my hands because they had started to shake, and saying, "It is a job, Dad. It is a real job. It matters." And he let out a small laugh, the kind that does not come from humor but from disbelief. "Matters?" he said, leaning back in his chair. "You are throwing away everything we invested in you to stand in a room making $40,000 a year babysitting other people's children." And a few people at the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one said anything, not my aunt who had always hugged me the longest, not my uncle who once told me I was the kindest person in the family, not even Daniel who just sat there, scrolling through his phone like this had nothing to do with him, like I was not his sister, like I had already been erased. And I felt this strange urge to look at my mother, to find something in her face that told me this was not real, that she would step in and say enough. But when I finally did, she just shook her head slightly, almost invisible, like she was telling me not to push it further, not to make it worse. And that was the moment I understood that this was not a conversation I could win. This was a decision that had already been made long before I ever walked into that room, And I thought about all the small things I had ignored over the years, all the times I told myself it was not that bad, that I was imagining it, that families were just complicated, but sitting there with 20 people watching and no one speaking, it was suddenly very simple. I did not belong here, not in the way that mattered, not in the way that counted. And my father leaned forward again, his voice calm now, controlled, like he was finalizing a contract. You can stay, he said. You can choose something respectable, something with a future, or you can leave and do whatever this is. But if you leave, do not come back asking for help, do not call, do not expect anything from us. And I remember nodding before I even realized I was doing it, like my body had already made the choice for me, and I stood up slowly, carefully, like if I moved too fast something might break, and I picked up my bag from the back of the chair. And for a second I hesitated, just a second, because a part of me still wanted someone to say my name, to stop me, to remind me that I was more than this moment, but no one did, and as I walked toward the front door, I heard my father's voice one last time behind me. This is your decision, Emily. And I did not turn around, I just reached for the handle, opened the door, and stepped outside into the cool night air. And that was the last time I left that house as their daughter. But what I did not realize then, standing alone on that driveway with nothing but my bag and a job offer in my hand, was that this was not the end of something, it was the beginning of a story they would not be able to control anymore. I sat in my car for a long time that night with the engine off, the dashboard clock glowing 9:47 p.m., my hand still wrapped around the steering wheel like I had forgotten how to let go. And the house behind me looked exactly the same as it always had, white columns, warm lights in every window, the kind of place people drove past and thought, that must be a good family. And I remember thinking how strange it was that something could look so intact from the outside while something inside it had just completely ended. And I did not cry, not then, not yet. I just reached over to the passenger seat, picked up my phone, and opened my contacts out of habit more than intention, scrolling past names I had known my whole life, realizing I did not actually know who I could call anymore, because the people who were supposed to be permanent had just made it very clear they were not. And that was the first time it hit me, not the rejection itself, but the absence, the sudden understanding that there would be no safety net, no one to catch me if things went wrong. And I turned the key, started the car, and drove away without looking back, not because I was strong, but because I knew if I looked even once, I might not be able to leave. And the next morning, I woke up in a small apartment I had found 2 weeks earlier, a one-bedroom on the 3rd floor of a building that smelled faintly like laundry detergent and old carpet, with a rent I could barely afford, on a starting teacher's salary. And I remember standing in the middle of that empty living room, sunlight coming through the blinds in thin lines across the floor, thinking, this is it. This is what it looks like to start over. And there was no audience, no applause, no one watching to see if I would succeed or fail, just me and a decision I had already made. And the first few weeks were quiet in a way I had never experienced before. No family group messages, no invitations, no check-ins, just silence. And I told myself I preferred it, that it was peaceful, but there were moments, small ones, when the quiet felt heavier than anything they had said to me. Like when I set up my classroom for the first time, arranging desks in rows, writing my name on the whiteboard, Miss Carter, and stepping back to look at it, waiting for that feeling of accomplishment to come, and instead feeling this sharp, unexpected ache because there was no one to share it with, no one to call and say, I did it. I am here. And still I showed up every day because the kids did not care about my last name or my family or what my father thought was respectable. They just cared if I listened, if I showed up, if I remembered their names. And slowly something began to shift, not in a dramatic way, not overnight, but in small moments that added up. A student who stayed after class to tell me they finally understood something that had confused them for weeks. A parent who shook my hand at a conference and said, thank you for not giving up on my son. A note left on my desk in uneven handwriting that said, you are my favorite teacher. And I started to realize that value did not always look the way I had been taught it should. It did not come with titles or salaries or approval from people who measured worth in numbers. Sometimes it came in quiet ways, ways that no one applauded, ways that did not make headlines. And I built a life around those moments, one paycheck at a time, one lesson plan at a time, learning how to stand on my own without waiting for someone else to tell me I was allowed to. And there were nights when I wondered if they ever thought about me, if my name ever came up at that same dining table, if my chair was still there or if it had already been filled by someone else. And every time that thought surfaced, I pushed it away because I told myself it did not matter anymore, that I had moved on, that I did not need them. And for a while I almost believed it, until something happened in my 3rd year of teaching that would change everything again. Something that started as just another ordinary school day, and turned into a moment that would quietly begin to rewrite the entire story they thought they had finished. It was a Tuesday morning in late October, The kind of morning where the air outside felt just a little sharper and the classroom windows fogged slightly before the heating system kicked in. And I was standing at the front of room 214 writing the day's objective on the whiteboard when I noticed that one desk was still empty, third row from the window, the same desk that had been empty more often than not over the past few weeks, and I remember pausing for just a second, marker in hand, because I had learned to recognize patterns like that, the quiet signs that something was not right long before anyone said it out loud. And his name was Marcus, 14 years old, bright when he wanted to be, but carrying a kind of weight that showed up in missed assignments and tired eyes. And that morning, something told me not to just move on with the lesson, not to just mark him absent and continue like everything was normal, so instead, after class, I walked down to the front office and asked if anyone had heard from him, and the secretary looked at me over her glasses and said, "We tried calling home." No answer. And that was all the system required, a call, a note, a file update, but something in me would not let it end there. And I do not know if it was instinct or stubbornness or just the fact that I had spent enough time feeling invisible to recognize what it looked like in someone else, but that afternoon after the final bell rang and the hallways emptied out, I sat at my desk and pulled up his emergency contact form, staring at the address longer than I probably should have, debating whether this was crossing a line, whether this was even my place. And then I remembered the way he had once stayed after class to ask me if people could actually change or if they were just stuck being who everyone said they were. And that was enough, and 30 minutes later I was driving across town, past the neighborhoods where lawns were trimmed and mailboxes matched, into streets where houses leaned slightly with age and paint peeled in corners people did not bother to fix. And I parked in front of a small duplex with a broken porch light and sat there for a moment, my hands resting on the steering wheel just like they had been years ago, feeling that same quiet uncertainty, except this time, I was not leaving something behind, I was choosing to step toward something. And when I knocked on the door, it took a while before anyone answered, and when it finally opened, it was Marcus, wearing the same hoodie he had worn the day before, his expression shifting from surprise to something guarded in a split second, like he was already preparing for disappointment. And I said his name, just his name, nothing else, and for a moment, he just stood there, not speaking, not moving, like he was trying to figure out why I was standing on his doorstep when I did not have to be. And behind him, I could see a dim living room, a television playing quietly, no adult in sight, and I realized then that sometimes absence was not loud, sometimes it was just quiet enough that no one noticed unless they chose to look. And I told him we had missed him at school, that there was a test coming up, that I wanted to make sure he was okay, simple things, practical things, because I knew better than to ask questions he was not ready to answer. And something in his posture softened just slightly, not a full shift, not a breakthrough, just enough to let me know I had not made the wrong decision by showing up, and I left that day without fixing anything, without solving anything, but with a quiet understanding that this was the kind of work that did not show up on resumes or dinner conversations. This was the kind of work that happened in small moments no one applauded. And over the next few weeks I kept showing up, staying after school, adjusting assignments, listening more than I spoke, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, things began to change. His attendance improved, his grades stabilized, and one afternoon as he packed up his bag, he looked at me and said, "You did not have to come that day." And I smiled and said, "I know." And he nodded like that answer meant more than anything else I could have said, and I walked back to my desk that afternoon with a feeling I could not quite explain. Not pride exactly, not relief, something steadier than that. Something that felt like purpose settling into place, and what I did not know, what I could not have known standing there in that quiet classroom with the late afternoon sun stretching across the floor, was that someone else had noticed, someone far outside those walls, someone who was about to turn a small, ordinary decision into something much bigger than I had ever imagined. The email came in at 6:12 a.m. on a Thursday, and I almost deleted it without opening it because the subject line looked like every other generic message that filled my inbox, something formal, something official, something that did not seem meant for someone like me. And I remember standing in my kitchen with a cup of coffee in my hand, still half asleep, staring at the sender's name longer than I should have, reading it once, then twice, because it did not make sense at first. Department of Education, Office of State Recognition. And my first thought was that it had to be a mistake, that maybe they had the wrong Emily Carter, because nothing in my life up to that point suggested that anyone at that level even knew I existed. And I almost swiped it away, almost went back to my normal routine of lesson plans and attendance sheets, but something made me tap it open, just a small hesitation, the kind that changes everything without announcing itself. And as I read the first line, my grip on the coffee mug tightened without me realizing it. "We are pleased to inform you that you have been nominated for the State Excellence in Education Award." And I actually laughed, not out of joy, but out of disbelief, a short, quiet sound that filled the empty apartment. because the idea felt so far removed from the way I had been seen for most of my life that it almost sounded like someone else's story, not mine. And I read it again, slower this time, making sure I was not misunderstanding, making sure this was not some automated message sent to hundreds of teachers at once, but it was specific, detailed, referencing my work, my classroom, even mentioning a student outreach initiative that I had started quietly after school without telling anyone beyond the administration. And that was the moment something shifted, not externally, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, like a small crack forming in a belief I had carried for years, the belief that what I did only mattered in small, invisible ways. And for a moment I just stood there, in a kitchen that still felt too quiet most mornings, holding that email like it was something fragile, something that could disappear if I looked away too quickly, and then almost immediately another thought followed, quieter but heavier. I have no one to tell. And that realization settled in slowly, the way it always did, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like a background noise that never quite turned off, because this was the kind of moment people usually shared, the kind of news that got phone calls, that got reactions, that got someone saying they were proud of you. And I had built a life where moments like this happened in silence, where the only person who witnessed them was me. And I set the phone down on the counter, took a breath, and told myself it did not matter, that I did not need an audience for this to be real, that I had chosen this path knowing exactly what it cost. And I carried that thought with me into school that morning, walking through the familiar hallways, greeting students, starting class like any other day, because nothing had changed on the surface. The desks were the same, the whiteboard still had yesterday's notes faintly visible in the corner, and the kids still needed me in the same way they always had. And for most of the day I kept the email to myself, not out of secrecy, but because I did not know how to say it out loud without it feeling unreal, until the final bell rang and the classroom emptied, and I sat down at my desk, opened my inbox again, and read it one more time, letting the words settle a little deeper, letting myself believe it just a little more. And that was when I noticed the last paragraph, the part one had skimmed over the first time, the part that mentioned a formal ceremony, attendance required, recognition at the state level, and one specific line that made my chest tighten. In a way I could not immediately explain. Award recipients will be recognized in person by the governor. And I stared at that sentence for a long time, longer than I had stared at anything else in that email, because suddenly this was not just about an award, it was about a moment, a public moment, a moment that could not be ignored or dismissed or quietly overlooked. And I leaned back in my chair, the late afternoon light stretching across the classroom floor just like it had weeks before. And for the first time in a long time I felt something I had not allowed myself to feel, not hope exactly, but something close to it, something that made me wonder just briefly what it would look like if the people who once decided I was not worth claiming had to sit in a room and hear my name spoken out loud by someone they respected. And I did not realize then just how close that moment actually was. The invitation arrived 3 days later in a thick white envelope that felt heavier than it should have. The kind of envelope that does not bend easily. The kind that makes you pause before opening it because you already know it carries something formal, something official, something that belongs to a world you were never quite invited into. And I remember picking it up from the small metal mailbox downstairs, turning it over in my hands as I walked back up the stairs to my apartment, noticing my name printed in clean black ink, Ms. Emily Carter. And for a moment that alone felt unfamiliar, like seeing myself through someone else's lens, someone who did not see me as a disappointment or a compromise, but as something defined, something complete. And I set it down on my kitchen counter and just looked at it for a while, longer than I needed to, because opening it would make everything inside real in a way I was not sure I was ready for. And when I finally did, carefully sliding my finger under the seal, I unfolded the letter inside and read it slowly, line by line, letting each word settle instead of rushing through it the way I usually did with official documents. And it confirmed everything the email had said: the nomination, the ceremony, the recognition, but it added details that made it feel different: the location, the date, the time, a large auditorium downtown with seating for over 3,000 guests, a formal program, a stage, a microphone, and one line that stood out more than all the others: recipients will be introduced individually by the governor. And I felt that same quiet tightening in my chest, not fear exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize something is about to place you in a space where you cannot disappear, where your name will not just exist on a piece of paper but will be spoken out loud in front of people who are listening. And I folded the letter back carefully, placing it on the counter like it might shift if I moved too quickly. And the first thought that came to me was not about what I would wear or how the ceremony would go. It was simpler than that, almost automatic. I have no one to bring, and I stood there in the quiet of my apartment, the refrigerator humming softly in the background, realizing that this was the part no one talked about, the part where success did not erase absence, where recognition did not automatically fill the spaces that had been left empty years ago, and I told myself it did not matter, that I had already learned how to stand on my own, that I did not need a row of familiar faces in the audience to validate what I had built, and for the most part that was true. I had practiced that belief long enough for it to feel steady, but there was still a small part of me that wondered what it would feel like to have someone there who had known me before all of this, someone who could see the distance between who I was then and who I had become now, and I pushed that thought aside the way I always did, replacing it with something more practical, focusing on what I could control: my classroom, my students, the work that had brought me here in the first place. And over the next few days, life continued in its usual rhythm: lesson plans, grading, conversations in the hallway, small moments that grounded me in something real, something consistent. But underneath it all, there was a quiet awareness that something was approaching, something that would pull me out of this contained world and place me in a much larger one. And then one evening, as I was finishing up paperwork at my desk after school, my phone buzzed with a number I did not recognize, and I almost ignored it, almost let it go to voicemail like I usually did with unknown calls. But something made me answer, and when I did, there was a brief pause on the other end before a voice spoke, professional, measured, the kind of voice used to being. "Listen to, Miss Carter, this is Daniel Carter." And for a second I did not respond, not because I did not recognize the name, but because I did, because it had been years since I had heard it directed at me in that way, and the room seemed to go a little quieter around me, like everything had just shifted slightly out of place, and I realized then that the moment I had imagined, the one I had tried not to think about, was no longer something distant or hypothetical. It was already beginning to unfold in ways I could not control. For a moment I thought I had misheard him, not because the voice was unfamiliar, but because it had been so long since it had reached me directly, and I stayed silent just long enough that he had to repeat himself. "Emily, it is Daniel." And there was something different in his tone, not warmth, not exactly, but something less certain than I remembered, something that did not carry the same quiet superiority he used to speak with at the dinner table. And I leaned back in my chair, looking around the empty classroom like I needed to anchor myself in something real before responding, and finally I said, "I know who you are." My voice steady, controlled, the way you speak when you are not sure what version of yourself you are supposed to be in a moment like this. And there was a brief pause on the other end, just a second, but enough to make it clear that whatever he had expected, it was not that. And then he cleared his throat slightly, shifting into something more formal, more practiced. "I assume you received the notification about the award," he said, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was exactly the kind of opening I should have expected from him. No acknowledgement of the years that had passed, no mention of what had happened, just a direct move to the point, like we were discussing a case instead of a relationship that had been cut off completely. And I answered simply, "I did." And again that small pause, like he was adjusting to the fact that I was not going to fill the silence for him, and then he continued, "The event is significant. There will be media, state officials, people who recognize the Carter name." And there it was, the first crack in the surface, the reason behind the call beginning to take shape, not concern, not curiosity, but reputation. And I felt something settle into place inside me, not anger, not even disappointment, just clarity, the kind that comes when something you already suspected is quietly confirmed. And I let him speak because I wanted to hear how far he would go, how he would frame this, and he did not take long. "It would be appropriate," he said carefully, choosing each word like it mattered, "for the family to be present." And I let that sit in the air between us for a moment before responding, because the word family sounded different now, heavier, almost unfamiliar, and I said, "We are not a family, Daniel." Not harsh, not raised, just factual, and for the first time since the call began, he did not have an immediate response, and I could almost picture him on the other end, standing somewhere quiet, processing, recalibrating, because this was not the conversation he had prepared for. This was not the version of me he remembered. And when he spoke again, his voice was lower, less certain. "Emily, things were said that night, emotions were high," and I felt a small, almost imperceptible shift in my chest at that, not because the words meant anything on their own, but because of what they avoided, because even now, he could not say it clearly, could not name what had actually happened. And I stood up from my chair, walking slowly toward the window, looking out at the empty parking lot as the last light of the day faded, and I said, "No, Daniel, things were decided that night." And the silence that followed was longer this time, stretching just enough to feel intentional, and then he exhaled quietly, like he was letting go of whatever script he had been following. "They want to come," he said finally, and that word, want, landed differently than everything else he had said so far. because it was the first time he had framed this as something personal, not strategic, not public but personal, and I closed my eyes for just a second, because this was the moment I had imagined in small, quiet ways I never fully admitted to myself, the possibility that one day they might reach out, that something might bring them back into my life, and for a brief moment something softer tried to surface, something that remembered what it felt like to want that connection, but it passed just as quickly as it came, replaced by something steadier, something built over years of standing on my own, and I said, why now? Not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a real question, one that deserved an answer, and on the other end of the line Daniel hesitated just long enough to make it clear that whatever answer he gave next would matter more than everything that came before. And I realized then that this call was not just about an invitation, it was about something much larger, something that was about to test whether the past could be rewritten or if it would simply repeat itself in a different form. The line stayed quiet just long enough that I could hear the faint background noise on his end, the kind of distant office hum that told me he was still in the world he had chosen, the world that had always made sense to him, and when he finally answered, his voice was different, stripped of the careful structure he had been using before. Because people are talking, he said, and for a second I thought I had misheard him again, not because the words were unclear, but because they were so direct, so unfiltered compared to everything else he had set up to that point, and I felt a small, almost involuntary shift in my expression, not surprise exactly but recognition, because that sentence carried more truth than anything else he could have offered, and I leaned my shoulder lightly against the window frame, looking out at the darkening parking lot as the last few cars pulled away, and I said nothing, letting him continue, because I wanted to hear how far that truth extended, and he did not hesitate this time. Your name has been circulating. The award, the program you started, the student outcomes. It is gaining attention. And I let out a slow breath because there it was, laid out in plain terms, not about me, not really, but about visibility, about recognition, about something that could no longer be contained within the quiet boundaries of my classroom, and he added, reporters have reached out. There is going to be coverage, and I closed my eyes for just a second because suddenly the ceremony felt different, heavier, not just a moment of acknowledgement, but a moment that would exist publicly, permanently, something that could not be dismissed or reframed once it happened, and I realized then that this was not just about them wanting to be present, it was about them needing to be present, and that distinction mattered more than anything else, and I opened my eyes again, focusing on the reflection of the classroom behind me in the glass, the rows of empty desks, the board with half-erased notes, the small, quiet world I had built piece by piece, and I said, so this is about optics. And he did not deny it, not immediately, and that silence was answer enough, but then he followed it with something softer, something that almost sounded like an attempt at honesty. It is not just that, he said, and I waited, because if there was more, I wanted to hear it, not for his sake, but for mine, to understand exactly where this was coming from, and he continued slower now, like he was choosing words that did not come naturally to him. They have been asking about you, and that sentence landed differently than the rest, quieter, less polished, and I felt something shift again, not enough to undo anything, not enough to erase the years that had passed, but enough to register, and I asked, since when? Because that mattered, because timing changes meaning, and on the other end there was another pause, shorter this time, but still there, still noticeable, and then he said, recently, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was predictable, because it fit perfectly into the pattern I had already recognized, and I nodded to myself even though he could not see it, and said, after the nomination. And again, he did not answer right away, and again that silence said more than anything else could have, and I pushed away from the window, walking slowly back toward my desk, because I needed to ground myself in something physical, something real, and I sat down, resting my hands flat on the surface, feeling the familiar texture under my fingertips, and I realized that whatever this was, whatever version of concern or interest they were expressing now, it was tied to something external, something visible, something that had finally reached a level they could not ignore. And I thought about the years before this, the silence, the absence, the complete lack of presence when there was nothing to gain, and I said, I have been here the whole time, Daniel. Not accusing, not emotional, just stating a fact. And on the other end, he exhaled again, quieter this time, like he understood exactly what I meant but did not have a response that could change it. And for a moment, neither of us spoke, and the space between us felt different now, not tense, not unresolved, but defined, like the boundaries had finally been drawn clearly enough that there was no confusion left. And then he said, they would like to attend the ceremony, more directly this time, no longer framing it as appropriate or implied, just asking. And I looked down at my hands, steady, grounded. And I realized that this decision, whatever I chose, would not change what had already happened. It would not rewrite the past, but it would define what came next. And I did not answer right away because for the first time since the call began, I was not reacting, I was choosing, and that difference mattered more than anything he could say. I could hear my own breathing in the silence that followed his request, steady but slower than before, like my body was taking an extra second to process what my mind had already understood. And I looked around the classroom again at the empty chairs, the faint outlines of erased notes on the board, the small space that had become mine without anyone's permission, and I realized something that felt both simple and heavy at the same time. I was no longer the person who had walked out of that house 5 years ago waiting for someone to tell me where I stood, and that meant this decision did not belong to them, it belonged to me, and I let that settle before I spoke because for the first time in this conversation I was not trying to explain myself or defend anything, I was just deciding, and I said, "They can attend." And I could almost feel the shift on the other end of the line, the slight release in his posture, the expectation that came with that answer, like he thought this meant something had been restored, something had been repaired, but before he could respond I added, "as guests." And that word changed everything, and there was a pause, longer this time, heavier, because he understood immediately what I meant, even if he did not say it out loud, and I continued, my voice still calm, still even, "They will sit in the audience like everyone else. They will not speak for me. They will not represent me." And I stopped there, not because I had more to say, but because that was enough, that was the boundary, clear and complete, and for a moment there was no response, just the quiet line between us carrying the weight of what had been said. And then Daniel spoke, slower now, more careful. "Emily, I do not think they are expecting." And I interrupted him, not sharply, not emotionally, just firmly. "I am not concerned with what they are expecting." And that was the truth, not said with anger but with clarity, because expectations had been the foundation of everything that had broken before, their expectations of what I should be, how I should live, what would make me acceptable, and I had spent years building something outside of that, something that did not require their approval to exist, and I was not about to reshape it now to make them comfortable. And I heard him exhale again, softer this time, like he was adjusting to a reality he had not prepared for, and he said, "I will let them know." And there was something in his voice that sounded almost like respect, not the kind that comes easily, but the kind that forms when someone realizes they are no longer in control of a situation. And I nodded to myself even though he could not see it, and said, "Thank you," because the conversation did not need anything more than that, and after a brief pause he added, "Emily," and I waited, not expecting anything specific, just giving him the space to finish, and he said, "You have done well." And the words were simple, almost understated, but they landed differently than anything else he had said so far, because they were not about optics or presence or reputation, they were about me, and for a second something inside me shifted. Something small but noticeable, like a door that had been closed for a long time opening just a fraction, and I considered responding, considered acknowledging it, but instead I said, "Goodbye, Daniel," and ended the call, not because I wanted to dismiss the moment, but because I did not need to hold on to it either, and I set my phone down on the desk, letting the silence of the room return, and for a few seconds, I just sat there, hands resting on the surface, feeling the steady weight of everything that had just happened, and then I stood up, turned off the lights, and walked out of the classroom, locking the door behind me the way I always did, because some things had not changed, some routines remained the same no matter what else shifted around them, and as I stepped outside into the cool evening air, I realized that the ceremony was no longer just an event on a calendar, it had become something else. Something that would bring two versions of my life into the same room, the one I had left behind and the one I had built on my own. And for the first time since receiving that letter, I understood that this was not just about being recognized, it was about being seen fully, clearly, without the filters they had once placed on me. And what I did not know yet was how that moment would unfold, how it would feel to stand on that stage and hear my name spoken out loud in front of them, in front of everyone, in a way that could not be undone or reinterpreted once it happened. The morning of the ceremony arrived quieter than I expected, not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, like any other day that had simply decided to carry more weight than usual, and I woke up before my alarm, lying still for a few seconds as the early light filtered through the blinds, realizing that this was the day everything I had built in silence would step into a space where it could not be overlooked, and I sat up slowly, moving through my routine with a kind of intentional calm, making coffee, getting dressed, choosing an outfit that felt like me, not something designed to impress or prove anything, but something that reflected the version of myself I had become, And when I looked in the mirror, I did not see the girl who had stood at that dining table years ago waiting for approval. I saw someone who had learned how to stand without it, and that difference mattered more than anything that was about to happen later that day. And the drive downtown was quiet, the roads already busy with morning traffic, people moving through their routines without any awareness of what this day meant to me. And there was something grounding about that, something that reminded me the world did not pause for individual moments, no matter how significant they felt. And when I arrived at the auditorium, the scale of it became real in a way it had not been before, the building rising several stories high, glass doors reflecting the movement of people entering and exiting, a steady flow of attendees dressed in formal attire, and I parked in the designated lot, sitting in my car for a moment with the engine off, hands resting loosely in my lap, taking one slow breath before stepping out, because once I walked inside, this would no longer be something I could observe from a distance. I would be part of it, fully, visibly, and as I entered the building, the sound shifted immediately. Voices echoing across the large lobby. Footsteps on polished floors, the low hum of conversation layered over everything, and I checked in at the registration table, giving my name, watching as the staff member's expression changed slightly when she recognized it, not dramatically, just enough to signal that this moment carried meaning beyond what I could see, and she handed me a badge, directing me toward the backstage area where the recipients were gathering, and as I walked down the hallway, away from the crowd and into a quieter space, I felt the atmosphere change again, less public, more focused, a place where everyone present understood the significance of why they were there. And I saw other teachers, some standing alone, some speaking quietly with each other, all carrying their own versions of this moment, their own paths that had led them here. And for a second I allowed myself to take that in, to recognize that I was part of something larger than just my own story, that this was not only about me being seen but about the work itself being acknowledged in a way that rarely happened. And then a staff member approached, going over the order of the program, the timing, the process of being called on stage, and I listened carefully, nodding when appropriate, but part of my attention was elsewhere, because I knew that somewhere in the audience, beyond the doors that separated this quiet space from the main auditorium, they were there, sitting among thousands of other people, waiting for a moment they had not been part of building, and I wondered briefly what that felt like for them, to sit in that space without control, without influence, just another set of faces in the crowd. And the thought did not bring satisfaction or resentment, just a quiet awareness of how much had changed. And when the time came to move toward the stage, I followed the group, stepping into position just off to the side where we would wait to be introduced, and from there, I could see the audience for the first time. Rows upon rows of seats filled with people, the scale of it stretching farther than I had imagined, and I scanned the crowd without meaning to, not searching for anyone specifically, but knowing they were there, somewhere within that sea of faces. And I realized then that this moment was no longer about whether they saw me or not, it was about the fact that I was standing here regardless. And as the program began, the lights dimmed slightly, the room settled, and the first name was called, followed by applause that filled the space, and I stood there, waiting for my turn, feeling the steady rhythm of the moment build around me, knowing that when my name was spoken, it would not just be a recognition of what I had done, it would be a statement of who I had become, in a way that no one in that room, not even them, could redefine. The applause for the previous recipient was still echoing through the auditorium when I felt the shift, not in the room but in myself, a quiet tightening in my chest that was not fear, not exactly, but awareness, the kind that comes when you realize your name is next. And I stood just off stage, hands relaxed at my sides, listening as the announcer's voice moved steadily through the program, each introduction polished, each accomplishment framed in a way that made the room respond. And then there was a brief pause, just long enough to reset the rhythm, just long enough for the next moment to land with intention, and I heard it. Please welcome Ms. Emily Carter. And for a fraction of a second everything else seemed to fade, not disappear completely but soften, like the edges of the room had pulled back to make space for that single moment. And then the sound came, the applause, filling the space in a way that felt larger than anything I had experienced before, and I stepped forward, not quickly, not hesitantly, just steadily, one step onto the stage, then another, the lights brighter than I expected, the room stretching out in front of me, rows upon rows of people rising slightly in my line of sight as I moved toward the center. And I did not look down, I did not rush, I just walked, because this was not a moment to reach for, it was a moment I had already arrived at. And as I approached the podium, I became aware of the governor standing to the side, waiting, his presence calm, composed, the kind of presence that carried authority without needing to announce it. and when I reached him he extended his hand and I shook it. The gesture brief but deliberate, and he looked at me with a small genuine smile, the kind that did not feel performative, and said quietly, "Thank you for what you do." And those words, simple as they were, landed differently than any applause, because they were direct, unfiltered, and I nodded once acknowledging them before turning toward the audience, and that was when I saw them, not immediately, not as a clear image, but as a recognition, a familiar shape within the crowd, and my eyes adjusted, scanning just enough to confirm what I already knew. My father sitting upright, shoulders squared, my mother beside him, hands folded in her lap, and Daniel slightly to the side, his expression more neutral than I remembered. And for a moment time did something strange, not slowing down exactly but layering, like the past and present were occupying the same space, the dining table, the silence, the words that had been said, all existing alongside this moment where my name had just been spoken into a microphone by someone they respected, someone they would have listened to without question, and I felt the weight of that contrast settle in, not as something overwhelming, but as something clear, something undeniable, and I turned my attention back to the audience as a whole, because this moment was not just about them, it was about everything that had led me here, every quiet decision, every day I showed up when no one was watching, every time I chose to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. And the governor stepped forward again, beginning to speak, outlining the reasons for the recognition, referencing the program I had built, the impact it had created, the students whose lives had shifted in ways that could not be measured by numbers alone. And I listened, not because I needed to hear it for the first time, but because hearing it out loud in this space carried a different kind of weight. And as he spoke, I realized something I had not fully understood until that moment. This was not just a recognition of my work, it was a validation of a path that had once been dismissed entirely, and there was no argument left to be made against it, no interpretation that could reduce it to something smaller. And when he finished, the applause rose again, filling the room with a steady, undeniable energy, and I stood there, not reacting outwardly, not raising my hands or signaling anything beyond a small nod, because the moment did not require that. It did not need to be amplified, it was already complete. And as I stepped slightly back from the podium, I realized that whatever happened next, whatever conversations followed, whatever attempts were made to reconnect or redefine what this meant, none of it could change what had just happened, because for the first time my name had been spoken in a way that did not depend on them, did not require their approval, and could not be taken back. When the applause began to settle and the program moved forward, I stepped back from the center of the stage, returning to the line of recipients, but something inside me had already shifted in a way that was quiet and permanent, not loud, not dramatic, just settled, like something that had been uncertain for a long time had finally found its place. And I stood there, listening as the next name was called, watching as another teacher walked across the same stage, received the same recognition, and I realized that the moment I had imagined for years, the one where everything would feel different, did not arrive with a sudden rush or a dramatic change. It arrived with clarity, with a sense of completion that did not depend on anyone else's reaction, and I let myself feel that fully without rushing past it, without trying to turn it into something bigger than it needed to be. And when the ceremony ended, the room shifted again, the formal structure dissolving into movement, people standing, talking, congratulating one another, the sound of voices filling the space in a different way now, less controlled, more personal, and I walked off the stage with the others, following the flow toward the side exit that led back into the main lobby. And as I stepped through the doors, the atmosphere changed immediately, brighter, louder, filled with people moving in different directions, some heading toward the exits, others gathering in small groups, and I paused just for a second, adjusting to the shift, holding the program booklet loosely in my hand, feeling the weight of the moment settle into something quieter, something that would stay with me long after this day ended. And then I saw them, not across the room this time, not from a distance but closer, standing near one of the tall windows that looked out onto the street. And for a moment no one moved, not them, not me, like there was an unspoken understanding that this was the point where everything that had been avoided would have to be faced directly. And I took a step forward, then another, not because I felt pulled toward them, but because I was no longer someone who avoided what needed to be done. And as I approached, I could see the details more clearly. The way my father's posture was slightly less rigid than I remembered. The way my mother's hands were clasped together tightly, like she was holding onto something invisible. And Daniel standing just slightly apart, watching, not intervening, and I stopped a few feet away, close enough that there was no distance left to hide behind. And for a moment no one spoke, And then my father did something I had not expected, something small but unmistakable. He looked at me fully, not past me, not through me, but at me, and said my name, Emily. And the way he said it was different, not authoritative, not dismissive, just direct, and I held his gaze steady, not searching for anything in it, just acknowledging it, and he continued, "That was impressive." And I recognized the effort in the words, the attempt to find language that fit a reality he had not planned for. And I nodded once, not dismissing it, but not expanding it either. And my mother stepped forward slightly, her voice softer. "We watched everything," she said, and there was something in her expression that I could not easily define, not quite regret, not quite relief, something in between, and I said, "I know," because I had seen them, because their presence had not gone unnoticed, and Daniel spoke next, more measured as always. "You handled yourself well." And I almost smiled at that, because it sounded exactly like him, controlled, precise, but different from before in a way that mattered, and for a few seconds the conversation hovered in that space, polite, careful, like everyone was aware that this was not a normal interaction, that there was history here that could not be erased with a few sentences, and I realized then that this was the moment where something could easily be misunderstood, where words could be taken as reconciliation, where presence could be mistaken for repair. And I felt that clarity again, the same clarity I had felt on the phone, the same understanding that had guided me through everything that led to this point, and I said, "You came as guests," not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a statement, a reminder of what had already been defined, and my father nodded slowly. "We did." And there was no argument, no attempt to redefine it, just acknowledgement, and I understood then that whatever this was, whatever version of connection existed in this moment, it was not the same as before. It was something new, something that existed within the boundaries I had set. And for the first time that did not feel like a loss, it felt like control, like balance, like something that belonged to me in a way nothing in that house ever had. And as we stood there, in the middle of a crowded lobby filled with people who had no idea what had just taken place between us, I realized that the most important part of this moment was not what they said next, or what they might say in the future. It was the fact that I was no longer waiting for them to decide who I was. We stood there for a few seconds longer, the space between us filled with everything that had not been said, everything that no simple sentence could resolve, and I realized that this was not a moment that needed to be extended or forced into something it was not. It was complete exactly as it was, and I gave a small nod, not as a signal of agreement or forgiveness, but as an acknowledgement that this interaction had reached its natural end, and I said, "I have to go," because I did not need to stay longer to prove anything, and my father nodded once in return, my mother's hands loosening slightly as if she had been holding her breath, and Daniel stepped back just enough to clear a path, and I turned and walked toward the exit, not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily, the same way I had walked onto that stage earlier, because leaving this moment did not require hesitation anymore. And as I stepped outside, the evening air felt cooler than before, the city quieter in that way it becomes after a large event ends, with people dispersing in different directions, conversations fading into the background, and I walked across the parking lot to my car, the sound of my footsteps steady against the pavement, and when I reached it, I paused for just a second, my hand resting on the door handle, because I could feel something settling inside me, something final, not in the sense of closing everything off, but in the sense of understanding exactly where things stood, and I got into the car, closed the door, and sat there without starting the engine, letting the quiet surround me, and for the first time in a long time, the silence did not feel empty, it felt full, like it was holding everything that had led me here, every choice, every moment, every step that had not been seen or acknowledged until now. And I thought about that night years ago, the dining table, the words that had been spoken, the version of me who had walked out carrying nothing but a decision, and I realized that I had spent a long time thinking that moment defined what I had lost, but sitting here now, it was clear that it had also defined what I had gained, the ability to build something without needing permission, the ability to stand in a room and be recognized without wondering if I deserved to be there, and the ability to look at the people who once decided I was not enough and understand that their decision no longer held any authority over me. And I started the engine, the familiar sound grounding me in the present, and as I drove out of the lot and onto the main road, the city lights stretching out ahead, I did not feel the need to look back, not at the building, not at the people inside it, because nothing behind me required my attention anymore. And as the road opened up in front of me, I realized that this was what it felt like to move forward without carrying something unfinished, not because everything had been resolved, but because I no longer needed it to be, And I drove in that quiet understanding, the kind that does not need to be repeated or reinforced because it is already clear, and as I reached a stoplight and waited for it to change, I caught my reflection briefly in the rearview mirror, not searching for anything, just noticing, and for the first time, I did not see someone who had been left behind or overlooked or defined by someone else's expectations. I saw someone who had built a life that spoke for itself, and as the light turned green and I moved forward, I understood that whatever came next, whatever opportunities or challenges or moments waited ahead, they would belong to me in a way nothing in my past ever had. And that was enough, more than enough. And as the city continued to unfold around me, I realized that the most important thing about this entire story was not the moment my name was spoken on that stage. It was the fact that I had learned how to say it for myself long before anyone else ever did.